clear from a trustworthy perspective. Then we've got on the far right, a very decentralized or business-led model where you have business authors that own and manage the data and the reports, and that's where it gets more complicated. And then we've got the middle of the road where some of our projects really fit nicely, where we can centralize the data and we can allow the functional people with the domain experience to create and manage most of the content for delivering of reports and dashboards and all that kind of stuff. Microsoft likes to call that discipline at the core and flexibility at the edge. So today I'm going to talk about ways that you can make that happen, but I want to be really clear, even though we always talk about, oh, IT is going to own the data set, right? Or things like that, the center of excellence or IT, whoever it is, that centralized team, really any business author that cares about this topic can absolutely take advantage of all of the techniques that I'm talking about today, assuming that it fits in with how you do things in your org. All right, so what do we mean by trustworthiness? A, we've got content quality. Of course, we want to make sure that the data is accurate. Okay, but it's more than that. How about we're using approved common definitions, the same language? I think we've all experienced some sort of pain point along those lines. We know who owns the data. We've actually assigned who's responsible for it. Fourth, the data provenance and the lineage is clear. Where does this data come from? How has it perhaps changed over time? Because that may or may not impact the level of trustworthiness that we assess to that data. Data duplication is minimized. And you got to remember, I have that data warehousing background. So this is one of my big things. And so we're going to talk about that during this session, but I like to try to minimize the level of data duplication to the extent possible. Self-service BI, of course, it's not possible to do that all the time across the board, but we can teach people the benefits of at least being aware of those kinds of things. So we'll get into that. Next, we know about our data and our load processes. And this might just be Power Query, scheduled refresh in Power BI, and it might be more than that, right, with other services behind the scenes. And that goes very closely with the whole data lineage side of things. Awareness of content. So this is that data discoverability that we're going to get to by the end of this, and that we know authorized users can see this data. The right people can find or not find the data. And last but not least, we know what it means to have responsible data use. And that's clear to the people in your company, whether they're a data creator or they're a data consumer. So when I talk governance, I got these 4 pillars. Trustworthiness is one of the pillars. So we're really taking a narrow tour today through lots more things that we would think about from an overall governance perspective, and really just talking about is the content you produce reliable, and which ways do we go about making that happen? All right, so shared data sets. In the agenda, you saw me say we're going to have 6, 7 different sections. I'm going to pause as we shift gears throughout this discussion. So if you have questions, toss them in the chat. Brent will help me manage the chat if you get a little bit noisy. I've got it in front of me, so if it's not too noisy, I can do that, but I'll enlist Brent's help if there's a lot going on. So feel free to do that, and I'll stop and take questions as we go along. So let's start with shared data sets. And this is all about reusing your data model. Now, where a lot of your content creators start is, I have one Power BI file per report. And in fact, a lot of people use the word report when they're talking about a PBIX file. And that always makes me cringe a little bit, because of course it's more than a report when you have that embedded data set right inside the Power BI file. So in this illustration here, I'm showing that I have 3 different Power BI files. They're all sales-oriented kind of reports. And this is natural. Every single author is going to do this. But the question is how quickly they progress past this, though. So the next thing that someone might realize is, oh yeah, I've got 3 different data sets now, and I don't want to go in 3 different places and change that calculation every time, right? Or things of that nature. So they realize, okay, let me move it all into one Power BI file, but that's got its own pain points too. Usually the biggest pain point there is more on the report consumer side. So you might have lots and lots and lots of reports that are all now in one single file, and that might make it more unwieldy, and it might make it just so broad that suddenly, you know, we've created this Swiss Army knife inside of one file. So the sweet spot is we start decoupling our habit of creating content, and here I'm showing those same 3 reports across the bottom, but they're all pointed to one data set file. And so what we've done is we've decoupled that report and data set creation experience, and we're publishing them as separate artifacts to the Power BI service. This is a habit change. This requires training. I wouldn't have people do this on day 1 of, you know, if you're doing training inside your organization, but I would very early in their journey of learning Power BI, I would at least teach them this is a thing that's possible, so that they don't end up with 50 Power BI files before they even realize it's possible. So what's happening here when we have decoupled it is we start to use the notion of a live connection. So I've changed my lines from being solid to dotted, which basically just means that we are taking an existing report and reaching into another area to get the data underneath it. So here I'm showing a Power BI report, paginated report, and an Excel report. So even though we're using different terminology for how it's connecting, same thing theoretically is actually happening. If you've heard anyone ever talk about the notion of a golden data set and thin reports, that's exactly what we are talking about here. And there's lots of reasons why we like this. The biggest one, perhaps, is that if you've got different people that do the work between data sets and report creation, now they don't have to share who's got that Power BI file cracked open. Different people can work independently in the separate Power BI desktop files. Because we have fewer data sets, we have fundamentally less risk of just inconsistencies and less maintenance and fewer things to validate and check and verify. So if you've been asked, where do we store customer name? You probably want to try to figure that in less files than more files, you know, that kind of thing. And then if, you know, depending on the industry you're in, right, your governance and your compliance requirements differ like crazy. So this notion of less duplication of data could be very, very important. Our report consumers, right? We talked about this a couple minutes ago. We can now say this report file handles this use case, and, you know, kind of customize what's actually in each PBIX file. Because we have fewer data sets, we have fewer data set refreshes to run. If you have a really picky source system, that's a big deal. You don't want 50 Power BI files all having to refresh if it can be reduced to just a few. Security. So we can start saying, where is this Power BI file going to be deployed to? Is it going to go to a particular workspace? Is that workspace deployed a little bit differently? Is it deployed to a separate workspace that has a separate app, right? You get the idea here that it gives us lots of more flexibility for how we're going to secure the content that people are going to see. Now, there are disadvantages. This is a thing because we're centralizing the data set. We've got to have a little bit more process around it. that means, we should have a little bit of change control involved. And that might be really light and that might be really heavy, but we don't necessarily want extra control, so to speak, for every single data set. This is self-service BI. People have to move fast. So it's not always a fit. And then depending on who owns and manages that data set, this might be somebody else in the organization that doesn't want to make the changes that you would like to see changed, right? And now we do have a way around that. We're going to talk composite models here in just a few minutes. So this isn't necessarily a deal breaker, but it's certainly possible that because of ownership and management, you say, nah, you know what, we're going to create our own. And the last thing I'll mention in this area is this idea of complacency. So just because we said we're using the golden data set, it doesn't mean that you don't have to test your reports. So our visuals can still be wrong. We can still create report level measures. The newest capability of composite models and, direct query for Power BI data sets and Azure Analysis Services is the really, really long way of talking about the newest functionality, lets us extend and customize that original model. So it doesn't mean we're completely off the hook, but it is certainly one of my favorite things to talk about. So let me show you just a couple quick things before we move on. And where I want to start is talking about impact analysis. So here, I've just got a sales data set. And what I want to do is I want to look at the lineage view for this particular data set. And the first thing that we see is across the top, I've got 3 workspaces for this one data set. It's being used by 10 reports, et cetera, et cetera. And I've been on vacation. So I've got 0 views here in my good old demo environment. But if you could imagine the reports that are dependent on this particular data set. So here's the data set we're looking at, right? And here's all the related reports in my sales analytics workspace. This would be basically the last 30 days. So you can see very quickly of, maybe this one is the biggie that gets most of the action. The other thing that's interesting in here is notify contacts. So all of the owners set for downstream content here that's got some sort of dependency on this data set, you can send a blanket message. You don't actually know who's getting it, but you send a blanket message that something's happening to this data set. So that's at least one way that you can communicate with people about the changes that are happening here. I think a better way is probably something over, in a Teams channel or wherever you've got the history, some sort of actual lightweight change log, right? But the notify contacts is a useful thing. Now, if I pop over to a different workspace for a second, what I want to do is start from the report side instead. So I'm going to start and I'm going to do a view lineage again, but this one's from the report. So, the other one we started from the data set, we were looking downstream, and that's more referred to as impact analysis because we're going downstream. Now that we started from the report, which is right here, and then our data set is right here, this is more like true upstream lineage. And so our experience is a little bit different, but we can see it from both ways to try to help understand, if I'm determining the trustworthiness of this report and I want to figure out where it came from, that kind of thing. And then if I pop open desktop here, and under Get Data, it is right here on the menu as well, but under Get Data, if I do the Power BI data sets, here's my sales data data set right at the top. We're going to talk in a little bit about these different endorsements and what those mean, but those show up first. There's also a nice little link here that'll take me to the Power BI service. I'm logged in as a different account than my demo tenant, so that actually doesn't work seamlessly for me, but for most of you, that should work fine. And so, if I choose that, this is creating that live connection now to that report. I'm sorry, to the data set. I misspoke. And then notice that I do not have on the far left, I don't have the data. All I have is the ability to create reports. And then thankfully, a few months ago, they gave us visibility to be able to actually see what the model looks like, which is really important for people to be able to see. Okay,
awesome.
So
that's awesome.
Yes.
Melissa, just really quickly, we have a couple of questions, if you don't mind taking some questions really quick.
Yeah, so I see Brian's question about, so thank you, Brent. Yes. External data is a tough one. And I think asking about best practices for external data without any context is very difficult for me to answer. So if you want to add some additional context to that, because I mean, what I don't necessarily know, do you mean just getting data from the web? Do you mean buying from third parties? Do you mean external users in your system, right? I'm not quite clear. So we can try to handle that one at the end if you want to give me more info. Tisha says, since we are moving to the cloud, we haven't had any experience with data sets yet. We haven't really been given much information, but I've heard about data sets with the cloud. And yes, to everything we've talked about so far is mostly Power BI service on the cloud. This idea of a live connection can't be done with desktop alone. She says, we'll pull our data from our HR data mart in SQL Server views through Alteryx and create a CSV file that you pull into Power BI. How will this be different for us or change the way we pull data now? If I were you, and we could talk about this for the next 20 minutes too. So to keep this short and sweet, if I were you, I would eliminate that middle CSV file, if at all possible. I understand that you probably need to clean it up. That's why you're using Alteryx apparently, to get it out of HR, do some stuff to it. The CSV file in the middle, right, is just an extra piece of the data architecture that you might analyze it and say, yes, we absolutely need it. Okay, fine. And if it stays, I would just make sure that it resides in some place, like OneDrive for Business, some sort of shared library, that kind of thing, where Power BI in the cloud can reach it reliably and reach it under multiple user permission contexts, right? So like not your own personal OneDrive, that kind of thing, and then be able to refresh it from that location. If you can go straight to SQL Server, have Power BI do the cleanup, if that works, that's even better, right? It's a more direct shot to the source. So I want to build the next step. So we talked about shared data sets. So let's talk about shared data a little bit further. And in this case, let's talk about data flows. So first, let's set a little context. And inside of a single Power BI file, when we are inside the Power Query query editor, when we do our data transformations and that kind of thing, that is one of the main pieces of our Power BI file to form the data model, right? And so that, of course, locks the data preparation work that's done in Power Query inside of one Power BI file. So if you find yourself copying and pasting some of that M script code from one Power BI file to another, or even if you've created your own little personal M script library, this is for you. So here's the starting point. And what we want to do is pull that piece that's right up here, the transform data, and we want to pull that out of being inside of one Power BI file. And so our starting point here, I've got 3 data sets and I've got 5 reports. And I have across these 3 data sets, I have some data preparation that can be reused among them all. And so how I would do that is with a data flow. And a data flow now is basically the same kind of functionality, but it's being done in Power Query Online instead. And so it's its own artifact inside the Power BI service. And that means then the data is, the data flow is a source for the data sets, if that makes sense. Brett talked a little bit about the beginning, about some new functionality. Most of the time, what's actually happening here is the data is imported once into the data flow, and then it would be imported a second, well, third and fourth time, but kind of our second tier here into the data sets as well. So you would have refresh operations happening at 2 levels. And so there's that new direct query type of functionality that would remove some of that. But keeping it simple, let's just think about it from the perspective of we're now going to do our work in Power Query Online instead of inside the Power BI file. And once again, this helps us with just different people that handle your data preparation versus your data modeling versus your reports. So you can have 3 tiers of Power BI files. Well, technically the top tier is not a Power BI file because it's in the service. This really helps if you have really complex source systems that just are a pain to get at the data, and your transformations inside of Power Query get pretty complex. That means you can have somebody that knows how to do that once, and then anybody who's a data set author can just get the data that's already all cleaned up from the data flow itself.
Alyssa, I don't want to break your flow, but I did want to mention there the data flow that I mentioned I love so much. I use a timekeeping software that has a cloud API. It has an API. If you know how to use Postman, you know how to write code, yeah, you can get at it. But I figured that out one time with Power Query. I write a data flow. Now anyone can connect to a table called timesheets.
And they don't need to deal with the API calls. And
exactly.
That's especially helpful for APIs because some of those companies give, heck, even Microsoft on their APIs does too. You might only have, say, 200 calls per hour, that kind of thing. And you can immediately, exceed your limits if you allow just anybody to call your API. So yeah, that's a great example. Thanks, Brent. This also lets you reuse common data. So if you think about things like date, customer, product that you want to be as consistent as possible across as many data sets as possible, stage them in a data flow for your data set authors just to go grab them. This is also useful for if there's a subject area that crosses the boundaries of teams, right? So maybe your annual budgets, anything, right? That is just useful data that can be reused. I've also seen a couple of customers that need to implement row-level security inside of your Power BI data sets. They need a good starting point. Well, maybe that good starting point is inside a SQL table somewhere, or maybe it's inside of a data flow. I'm not going to go down in the weeds with this, but you can set it up to where you can actually see the data in the data flow behind the scenes. It's always stored in Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. And you can basically configure it so that you can also access that data independently through other tools or even just to grab snapshot backup files. And that gives you even additional reusability of that data if you set it up that way. And then this also lets you, especially if you don't have an authoritative data warehouse, to say this is where certain types of authoritative data sit for our Power BI reporting purposes. Just like we talked about before, reducing the load on our source systems can be a very big deal. Fewer data set authors need to even get at the original data set. The data source. And so if operational data access is taboo in your company, this is a great thing to kind of sit in the middle. Helps with consistency as well. So if we go back to that example of our date table, our customer table, that sort of thing, if we put as much as we can into that data flow for friendly names, defining data types, adding calculated columns, getting rid of unnecessary columns, that's less work the data set authors need to do and the more consistency that they get. We can't do DAX queries, of course. Those always have to live down in the data set. But anything that's, column row level and not, the aggregate magical queries, those we can do over on the Power Query Online side. So let me show you just a couple quick things to give you a little better frame of reference. So let me go to this workspace, and I've got one data flow that I just call my company-wide DW tables. And it has 3 tables in it: customer, date, and machine. If I edit this data flow, okay, let's try that again. See if you want to behave. Thank you very much. And let's edit the tables. They used to be called entities, by the way, and there's been a rename in the last few months sometime to make it a little friendlier for people terminology-wise. All I really want to point out here is that this is just the same thing as Power Query. They are slowly but surely getting Power Query Online to have feature parity with what's in desktop. So if you like to work in desktop for this kind of work and not so much in the web, you still have this advanced editor available. You can just copy and paste the finished thing in here, and you don't actually have to do all of your work in the web. So just kind of wanted to reiterate that it's the same familiar kind of experience. Now, if I go back to, scooch out of there for a second, back to Power BI Desktop for a second.
And Melissa, I feel like I heard you say that you have some specific times maybe for questions that you planned on using, or did you want to take those as they come in?
Yeah, at each one of the transitions, and we're about done with this section. So
gotcha. Okay.
I think the next one's really just a statement rather than a question. So, but yeah, pop them in if you've got them. So I just went in to get data from the desktop. Under Power Platform, we have Power BI data flows. And if I do a connect, the thing that I want to emphasize here is that you are not limiting your Power BI data set authors. And so, if I just go to that same common data, let's just grab customer because I don't care about anything else for right now. And I'm just going to go to transform data. Guess what happens? I go into Power Query inside of Power BI Desktop. So if I need to do more work, I can. So just because we're saying start with this data in a data flow as your source, we're not saying you're limited, Mr. or Mrs. data set author. So I think that's a really important point. All right. So that takes us to.
So Melissa, the statement, I got a little more clarification from Brian on that. And I don't know if he has audio or not right now, but when he was mentioning external data, he was thinking about bringing data from outside the company and making it available inside the company. And so when we talked about APIs, he mentioned kind of best practices around connecting to APIs, also like website scraping for public data, and how, any recommendations on how to make that available.
Yeah. I don't do a ton of development work these days. So that's not, that sort of detailed question of, hey, what's a best practice that I should use kind of a thing. Let me let my subconscious think on it. There's been a couple of people in the community in the last few months that have talked about getting data from APIs. I want to say Alex Powers just had one of those sessions recently, and the London Power BI user group had one sometime a few months ago that I've been meaning to watch, and I haven't watched the recording yet.
I'll find links to those and put them in there. Thank you. That's great.
Yeah, most of the time I'm just getting data from the Power BI APIs, and then of course we're dealing with authentication and blah 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 blah, but without going down rabbit holes and thinking a nice high level beautiful best practice. Let me let my subconscious think on it just a little bit. So thank you for the clarification. And if anybody else does want to pipe up, just stick a comment in there, and I will stop talking and let you talk for a minute to offer some advice. Okay, so composite models. Let's build on what we've talked about just a little bit more. So we talked about, if we step back to the data sets for a minute, we talked about that live connection. So here we've got one data set, we've got 3 reports and a live connection. But historically, the problem with that has always been that report can connect to one live connection. And that means I have to have everything I need inside of that data source. Other than, I can do a few report level measures, but really, you can't add extra data sources to it. And that, what we jokingly think of as the Holy Grail sometimes, is something that has been resolved with some new functionality. So if you think about what's happening here, we've got one main data set up here, and then we have other data sets that are connecting to it. So we're basically setting up a hierarchy, if you will, a chain of dependencies. And then your reports would be done on the secondary level data set. So a lot of times you might hear people talk about IT is going to maintain this top one, and a department might maintain one down here after they've added their extra data, which might be sitting in Excel, or it might be in a data flow, it might be a web API, whatever it is that they need to add to it in order to get their analysis done. So that's what we're talking about here. And so what actually happens when we are combining these multiple connection types is, let's say we start with this organizational sales data set, and we're going to call that guy our remote model. And the live connection is flipped to being a direct query for Power BI data set. And so then, because we flipped it to direct query, we now have the notion of a local model. So we've got the direct query piece plus the local model piece is what ends up making it that we say that this is a composite model, or we have multiple connection types. And this, of course, is great to extend a centralized data model, right? We might need a new source, we might need new measures, et cetera, or we can even personalize that centralized model. So if we want to reformat or rename some things, those changes are only stored down in our local model. So that's really nice. Again, different people can manage these different data sets. So that fight we had way at the beginning of this conversation about who owns the data set and will they make the change you wanted, this is one way that we could get around that. And certainly my favorite topic, less duplication of effort and reduce risk, all the same stuff that we talked about before. Now, downsides, you're querying a remote model. So performance, right? There's, you got to test it and see what's going on. It's still maturing. It's still in preview. It was released late 2020. There's all the limitations are documented. One of the biggest limitations that you need to know about. So we're not talking security in depth in this section, but normally, if you are a consumer of a report down here, right? Normally, you would only need read permissions on a data set to be able to run this report. You need the build permission on all the levels of the chain to be able to be the consumer of a report down here, which is a very bad thing. The Power BI team knows about it. I don't know. I haven't seen anything publicly about exactly when it's going to get fixed, but they know about it. Lots and lots of customers are grouching about it for sure. All right, so let me see here. Okay, I'm gonna look at what Jeremy said in a little bit. Brent, you can let me know if there's anything I need to come back to that. So let's talk certification for a little bit here. So what are we thinking about here as we've started to encourage reuse of data? How do we let people know how trustworthy this is? If we're saying this is a centralized data set, please use it. So there's basically two types of endorsements that we are concerned with here. So the first one is certified, and this is the biggie. This is the one where we say this is trustworthy. And what that means, or should mean if you're using it right, is that some rigor has occurred, right? It's been validated, it's been tested, it's been through whatever light or medium or high change control processes you have in place. Now, promoted is more just, hey, the author of this content wants to say that it's available. They just want to amplify. Now, it doesn't mean that it's not trustworthy, but it does mean something less than certified. And certified, to be able to do that, you've got to have permission in the tenant settings. Promoted, anybody that has permission to edit the content can set it to be promoted. So that's why it means something less. Now there's three buckets of, or I should say distinctions of how we endorse content. There's the data, there's the reports, and then there's our collection of reports and dashboards that we would publish in an app. And these three distinctions are actually very, very, very important. So let's first, not what we can't endorse, by the way, before I move on, dashboards, workbooks, and workspaces as a whole can't be endorsed, at least for right now. So the dashboards and the workbooks, that's kind of an annoyance, but that's the way it is. Not exactly sure why. I'm sure there's a technical limitation. So let's talk about data certification. So here we've got our data sets, our data flows, that kind of thing. If we've certified a data set, we're saying that the report authors are accepting a dependency on that data set, and they're willing to use that as a source for their reports. So they basically are saying, if I use this, I'm going to trust it. A certified data flow is more targeted towards your data set authors that are willing to accept a dependency and trust that data flow for creating their own data sets. But either way, these kind of data certification is targeted to your authors that are building either reports or data sets. Now, a certified report, you see where I'm going here, that's got to be targeted to your consumers of the report. And it's more about, I'm going to trust this data to make business decisions off of it. So the former talking about our authors, this one's talking about our consumers. Where it gets trickier is when we've got an app. We're saying, hey, if we have certified this app, everything that's been added to the app, you should be able to trust it. Let me show you what I mean by that in a quick demo. So if I go back to my sales analytics workspace, and if I sort by endorsement, I've got 2 reports that are certified and 1 report called Call Center Stats, which is set to promoted, okay? All 3 of them are set to be included in the app, But notice that I have a whole bunch more items that are included in the app that do not have any sort of endorsement set. Okay, hold that thought. If I go to, let me resort here so I can find it, my product sales analysis report, and I look at its settings, this is how we get that to show up. And so here's the certified, there's the promoted, and then of course, none would be the default. Again, this certified is required by the tenant settings to be able to do it. At the end, if we have time, I'll show you some of the relevant tenant settings. So just let me know if you're interested in that. So knowing that we've got our 3 items that have endorsements, let's next look, if I go up here to this ellipsis and I go to edit app endorsement. So this is the thing as a whole, right? The entire app is set to be certified. And you can probably guess where I'm going with this, because we said that a bunch of stuff's in the app that isn't set to be endorsed. And then the next concern that we have is that, this individual item is set to promoted, but the app is set to certified. So what you need to do is come up with your own process for, if the app is set the endorsements, what do you do at the workspace level? And if there is a difference, how much do you care? Because if someone goes and looks at it through the app and then goes and looks at call center stats through the workspace, they're going to see something different. So by the way, if I just go back to, and we take a look at the app itself, my browser is covering it up just a little bit, which is very annoying. I wish they would get that fixed, but see how it's got the little certified label way at the top of the page, and it will do that for every single report because it's picking up the app level certification label. Okay, so that's a little bit more about process and awareness for you. All right, let's talk a minute here about separate workspaces. Now we've talked about, we've got our single data set, multiple reports, and we've got different people responsible for maintaining the data versus the reports. Let's play pretend for a second. So where do we publish this content if I've got separate people that are responsible? So let's say first, we're going to have a data workspace. And second, we're going to have a report workspace. The reason that that's really nice is that the data workspace, what we can manage is just at the workspace level. Our BI people, our IT people, our center of excellence, right? Whichever one of those manages this kind of content. And our data authors for that particular subject area. So in this case, this is my sales data. So I would have one or more workspaces devoted to the sales organization. So those kind of people can have the workspace role, and they're probably members or admins. At the report level, more people are going to be able to have access with the workspace role for who can publish these different reports. And that's where we've got, contributor, member, admin, and a build permission on the data set. That's how we say you're allowed to build new reports from this data set. So those are the 2 things that you would manage for your actual report authors. And what that does for you is it removes that game of saying, oh, I promise I am not going to touch the data set. I will only ever edit reports in this workspace. So certainly we've got our audit log. Certainly we can audit who does what, but setting up the permissions in the first place separately gives us a whole lot of benefit here. It gives us clarity on who actually owns and manages this content. incidentally, this picture shows a data workspace here for data flows, 2 data workspaces for data, and then more data workspaces for reports. So a lot of people tend to do these 3 layers if different people manage data flows versus the data sets. So definitely the whole clarity on editing, viewing, managing, etc. That build permission is what allows us to bridge across workspaces and not over provision. And then here's the biggie. Here's the really exciting one. If you've ever experienced in one workspace somebody that's allowed to publish reports, but pulling data from a data set in that workspace and row level security isn't working because they have edit rights. Row level security only works if you have view permissions or read permissions on it. So that means if you only have read and build on these data workspaces, your report creators that only have write permissions down in the reporting workspaces, row level security still works. And that's a really big win. The downside is, yep, we've got more workspaces. So if you already have chaos, you might not really love to hear this idea. However, in a lot of cases, it gives us such good advantages. So let me switch back here very quickly and go to so if we just take a look at my workspace list, there's a whole bunch of different things that we could talk about here, but what I want to do is just kind of point out that from a naming convention perspective, I know that anything that's got data in it is a data workspace intended to store data sets and or data flows. So for instance, if I go to sales analytics and I sort by type, here I only have dashboards, reports, and workbooks. If I go to sales data and I sort by type, I have a whole bunch of data sets. Oh, I have some reports. You might say, Melissa, why? And I'm gonna answer that here in just a second, but I won't leave you hanging. If you've ever published just a data set and said, oh, I've got the empty report problem, this solves that. This isn't pretty. This is really ugly. But it's some different documentation about the data set. It's a little change log of who changed what in the data set. So it kind of solves that problem, and it embeds some documentation to help you or someone else later that's managing this particular data set. So that's why in a reporting workspace, I wouldn't normally see data sets, sometimes, but rarely. Whereas in a data workspace, I might see some of these other ones. And I do, by the way, if you spotted the dashboard, that guy here is just to say, hey, this is a data workspace. Da, 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 da.
Do something
All
similar, right. Melissa, on your, do you have just data sets that have like one page, a report that says one page and says, or do you just delete the report that comes along with the data set?
No, that's exactly what I was just showing with
gotcha. Okay.
I'm glad you asked. That's exactly what I was showing with, this is just a report page, this documentation and the change log. Very, very, like it's not beautiful, but it's the level of effort is so easy. So that's what I tend to like to do with them.
Melissa, this is, I just noticed that your browser is zoomed out to 90% there. So I don't know if that might be affecting what's cutting off the top of your
What's odd is it's Firefox. And even if I close my handy toolbar, it keeps it. If I open the browser, it looks great until it doesn't. And so the last time I did a demo a few weeks ago, I thought, oh, good, I closed it, I reopened it, and it looked good. And then it didn't. So I haven't quite figured out what's wrong. And I've just been hoping that Firefox fixes it.
You see like next to Peyton Power BI admin, it's like 90%. I think it might be zoomed out. So if we go to 100, I don't know if that might make a difference.
Oh, you mean this?
Apparently not. Apparently not. It looks like it's still cut off.
Yeah, yeah, that's there, by the way, because I'm using inside of Firefox these little containers. So
gotcha.
Yeah, it's very odd. All right, so I have one last little bit, and then we can open it up to any last questions that you have. So first, you kind of heard me say this before, but I wanted to just revisit it of if you are going to certify content, if it's data, so mostly data sets here, but certainly data flows as well, right? You want to review your data sources, your lineage. You want to do a tech review of your data model. You want to do a security review, and not just row level security inside of desktop, but where is it getting published to, and what's the security there? Is it proper? Certainly the data accuracy piece. Certainly documentation. There's more, but at a minimum, these are the kinds of things that you really need to think about if you're going to start saying certification is indeed meaningful. And then reports, certainly, we review the report content, and then depending on the circumstances, you might get a slightly lighter data review. So if you don't have a plan in place, it doesn't have to be horribly burdensome, but certification should be consistent. Ideally, if you said, I have 5 data sets that are certified across 5 different workspaces, ideally the level of trustworthiness for those is equal if they're certified. And I know that's so much easier said than done, but that's kind of the goal to seek to. Report documentation, I just showed you a quick example, right? Things like what's the purpose, what's the target audience, what are the business rules that we built into our calculations, things like that would be really helpful to be included with either the data set and or the report itself. You might publish more documentation to certain people, like the change log or even validation results and what your reconciliation process was. And, if it's repeatable and because it's pulling against a data source and doing some repeatable automated type of validation there, that sort of thing. I wouldn't necessarily make that available to every consumer necessarily, but something that could be useful for some people. And then your workspace and your artifacts themselves. So artifacts being, your reports and your data sets and such, they each have a contact, a description, and most anyways have a sensitivity label. And those items can be very, very helpful. And then finally, making your data set discoverable. And so the idea behind this is even if they cannot access it, letting people know that it exists so that if they say, I needed to pull some month-end inventory lists. I see that this one already exists. Is this exactly what I need so I don't have to reinvent the wheel? So let me show you what this looks like. And let me start with the Datasets Hub. And so this is relatively new in the last, 4 to 6 months, something to that effect. And basically it started out as showing every single data set that you personally have access to via workspace permissions, via read, via build, the different ways that you could get access to a particular data set. So if I clicked on one in particular, sales data, we would then see a little bit more information about it, like the different details, and here's related reports. So here's a different way that we could basically see lineage or impact analysis for the particular data set and that sort of thing. So if we let me go back 1 second here. And if I go to the settings for this sales data set, where I want to take you is a brand new, as of last month, property. And it's called Make Discoverable. So this doesn't light up unless you've either chosen it to be promoted or certified. But if it is one of those, you can also then check make discoverable. So this is not checked by default. But if you check it, what happens is, let's say my coworker, Alex, goes to his datasets hub. And even though he doesn't have access to sales data, he'll see it appear. So basically it makes the metadata about its existence visible over here on the datasets hub. So for instance, that's a great thing to do for the sales data, which is really commonly used by a whole bunch of different authors. I'll bet you I would not ever do that on, say, this executive bonus tracking data set, that kind of thing. So it's very, very cool. In that new Power BI adoption roadmap that Brent announced at the beginning of the session, which let me pull it up and plop.
And I'll put the link in the chat right now. Oh,
actually, I'm right there with you.
Okay. Thanks.
So somewhere in here where we talked about, it hasn't been very long. Where did I put it? In one of these sections, we kind of talked about data discovery being one of the key 3 pillars. There we go. I put it right there. So lots and lots of good stuff to view in here, but it's data discovery, data democratization, and data literacy are kind of 3 very, very big topics that are important for rolling out BI successfully and all that good stuff. All right, so that's the end of what I had pre-prepared to talk to you about. So with whatever time that Brent lets us have left, are there any final questions that you all still have?
Yeah, we have until 1 o'clock. So, I mean, please.
Oh, good.
Away. Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll just say, but while people are formulating their questions, thank you, Melissa. That was excellent. Way to go. That's a great presentation and really gives a good roadmap for people to walk down to get some trustworthy data content out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
Amazing presentation for sure.
Thanks. And this one that I just starred is, if you want the slides that we just went through, that's where you can find them.
I'm curious, Melissa, how much you've used the deployment pipelines feature and, how that might play into the whole idea of trustworthiness here.
Yeah. So the good news is that it's an easy way to have a development workspace, a test workspace, and a production workspace. So that's really great from a trustworthiness perspective because, hey, if something is changing, you can shield production completely. And it's created in a way that, business users that care to learn how to do this can absolutely do it without a ton of training, right? You don't have to fire up Azure DevOps and have a CI/CD pipeline and all this kind of stuff. The bad news is that it doesn't yet play nicely with the idea of separate workspaces and dependencies. So that whole thing we talked about with data workspaces and report workspaces and dependencies, they will make the pipeline smarter over time because they know that this is important. But it's not yet very mature with respect to saying across workspaces, something is changing and there's a dependency over there, right? You really have to keep track of that yourself and deploy things in the right order. The other gotcha that I feel compelled to mention really quick while we're talking about gotchas in that way, if I go and I do an update app, so an app is just a collection of reports that we want to deploy in a bundle, in an app. And so they each have little yes, no flags inside the workspace. So here, I would set up for each item, that had the yes, no flags, how they appear in the app. It's a great way to deploy content for your consumers If they don't need to see the workspace, just have them consume the app. That's great. The gotcha is if you're using those separate workspaces with the data and the reporting workspaces, there is this right here that, that is set by default when you deploy an app. So what's happening here is we have a separate set of permissions for the app itself. So that's great. That means if you want, you can only say my authors and creators access workspaces and my consumers get the content through an app. That's really commonly done. Problem that we get into is that if you say yes to this checkbox and your data set is in a different workspace than this app, it can't automatically go and set the build permission for the data set. You'll have to set that separately yourself, which is fine if you're using groups for your permissions. It's fine to kind of manage that separately, but this cannot reach across those boundaries. Again, Microsoft knows, I would imagine the technical limitation will get lifted at some point, but just a gotcha to know about.
Yeah. What other questions are out there? You can put them in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, that's totally fine.
Yeah, let me read what Jeremy said too.
Yeah. And while you're reading through that, I'll just mention in the chat, if you can pull that up, there are links not only to the slides for this presentation that Melissa makes available, but to a recording already. Honestly, I recorded today's meeting, but that one was from March, and so I may just link to the existing one where then you wouldn't have to upload it all over again. Sure.
That one was for the Power BI team themselves, so it's actually their YouTube channel, which is cool. Some of the stuff that we talked about with especially the dataset discovery that just came out in June, that part isn't on there. And I've fine-tuned a couple little things, but it's like 90% the same. Okay. So your call.
All right. Sounds good. Well, I had not asked you beforehand about recording, and I often do, and I'm sorry I didn't. And so I was hesitant to start. I was going to just say I won't post it if you don't want me to, but I'm kind of taking it from the fact you have it on your own website that it's okay if we put it on our YouTube channel.
Absolutely. Go for it.
Thanks. Yeah,
Brian reminded me in the chat, and thank you very much, that there are a few tenant settings that are really important to make some of the pieces that we talked about work. So let me call out just a couple of them. One of them is use data sets across workspaces. So normally my recommendation is just let everybody in the organization do that. That allows, if you're using live connection from a report that's here, but the data set is elsewhere, it just fundamentally allows that to work. Let's see, I think there was 3 of them in total. The next one is the allow live connections. I've had one person that I've talked to in the past that had such a rigorous process for what you're allowed to do in Power BI, be it an author or a consumer, that they have groups that people were in, that they set this to say, only certain groups of people can do live connections. But this controls not only, the Power BI desktop live connection, it also controls Analyze and Excel connectivity, because it's basically the same idea. So again, I like to leave it wide open unless you've got a really solid justification for why you would limit it. And then the other last one, we were talking about how anybody can promote content, but only certain people can certify content. So what you want to do is come up with a group of people that are trained in what is required. And this is just kind of one batch of people. So whether it's certifying data sets or reports or whatever, even if the process is different, there's still just one tenant setting and it's across your whole tenant. So it's not like, oh, these people can certify in this workspace. It's not that granular or anything. I think those were the biggies.
Hey, Melissa, this is Zoe. I just wanted to say your presentation was great. Thank you. And also, you just answered my question, which was on the certification, how to do that on the tenant settings, because I have run into that one before where we're trying to certify, but we couldn't figure out where we had to add things. And so anybody you have a security group there. So anybody in that security group can actually go ahead and certify a data set.
Yes. And in fact, they can certify anything that they have edit permissions to. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure. And then I should mention the new discovery settings. There's 3 of them here that if you, for whatever reason, wanted to completely turn it off in your entire tenant and say, nope, you have to have true security in order to even see its existence, you could in fact disable all of that, or at least until you're ready to handle it. That kind of thing, you could make that happen.
Okay, anyone else? Don't be shy. We have about 8 more minutes. Okay, well, with that, I was about to expect someone to break in just a second. I'll just mention that our next meeting, we will not meet on the 3rd Thursday. We have a special presenter lined up once again for August, and but she wasn't available on the 3rd Thursday, and so I believe we are looking for August 18th. And Zoe, do you want to tell about that? Because this is your friend.
Yes, sure. So she's I think it's Brigatti, and she's a new MVP for Power BI, and she is excited to, and she happily volunteered her time to come talk with us. And I think she's going to talk about my favorite topic, which I think is great, and I'm excited to see someone else talk about it, but is buttons in Power BI and how to utilize those effectively. So I'm super excited. And so, so she's a super user as well on the Power BI community forums, so you can hit her up there as well. But yeah, she's fantastic, and I'm looking forward to her talk.
Great, thank you. So that will be August 18th, I think, which is not the 3rd Thursday, but we'll put that on the calendar. And I hope by that time we'll know a lot more about our fall meeting. And if we are having a big fall meeting, we might not meet in September, sort of in advance of that bigger October in-person, probably in-person and virtual hybrid meeting. All right, with that, the new website. Okay, Rana, I will put that. Rana asked me about the new website. I will put that in the chat right now. I should have done that every meeting. What a great idea. It is community.powerbi.com. This is the overall, I'll put it to everybody here. Sorry, Tisha. Clicked on the wrong thing. There it is for everybody. And I'll get our exact user group pulled up too and put that in the chat as well. Okay, well, with that, I think I will say have a wonderful Thursday, and thank you again to Melissa and to all of you for being here and making time. I hope you have a great week.
Hey, thanks, everybody. Take care.
Awesome.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Brian, you doing okay? Still there?
Hey, I'm here,
Hey.
Brent. How are
All
you,
right,
man?
cool. I'm doing fine. Thanks. I just saw your name pop. We were the only two left, and I just wanted to say hello. Hope that you're doing good.
Doing well, doing well.
Yeah.
Just coming back from a vacation
That's
last
good.
week and getting in the flow of things. And this happened to be not conflicting with my monthly cadence of meetings. So I was able to live attend in person. So
Wonderful. Wonderful. I'm glad. Was everybody able to go on the vacation? Sebastian able to get off of work and all that? I'm sorry, I might have lost your audio there, or maybe I'll stop recording too.